Sunday, September 27th, 2020, Maneco 64, home of alternative economics and contrarian views. So today we're going to talk about inflation and how the state alone is responsible for inflation and currency devaluation. And that's according to Felix Somary, who was one of the most influential bankers in the World War I, World War II, and even post-war World War II period. He was advisor to many governments, including the US government. And that's what he said in his book, or his memoirs entitled The Raven of Zurich, The Memoirs of Felix Somary. I did a video about that 4 years ago in August 2016. I was warning people back then in the UK not to buy into the mantra or the scapegoating of Brexit for the inflation that we've had, for the rising cost of living, right? There's a lot of opinions about what inflation is, but it's very simple. And I've gone over this many times. So let's look at the Webster dictionary definition from the 1970s to see what inflation really is, right? It says here, an abnormal increase in the volume of money and credit resulting in a substantial and continuing rise in the general price level. So the rise in price level is the consequence of inflation. The price level data that we get is not inflation, the CPI or PCE that has been doctored for many years, right? And if you want to see how these numbers are doctored, go to shadowstats.com. John Williams has been covering this subject for years. The analogy is that someone says to you, oh, you can lose weight and you won't be fat anymore, or you won't be overweight anymore. And all they do is tinker with the scale. So you're still eating, you're inflating your body, and you still look overweight, even though your weight says otherwise. That's what they've been doing to the system. They've been fooling people into believing that there is no inflation. And why do they do that? Well, because they want to keep the everything financial bubble going, and they have to justify the low rates. They have to justify the inflation, right? And who loses? Of course, the general public loses, right? The bottom 90% loses. Even before this crisis this year, supposedly we had the greatest economy ever in the States. There's still a huge percentage of Americans that didn't have, like, I think $400 saved in case of an emergency. How can that be a great economy? And even the Federal Reserve Board tells us the consequence of inflation. It shows here that in 1989, the top 1% owned 23.5% of the wealth. Now, the latest figures, they own 32.5%. The bottom 90 used to own 35.5%. And now the bottom 90 owns 28.9%. But even worse, the bottom 50%, they used to own 3.7% of the wealth back in 1989. The latest figures in 2019, they only own 1.4%. So that's the inflation. And even John Maynard Keynes said so. This is what he said, John Maynard Keynes. Lenin is said to have declared that the best way to destroy the capitalist system was to debauch the currency. By continuing process of inflation, governments can confiscate secretly and unobserved an important part of the wealth of their citizens. By this method, they not only confiscate, but they confiscate arbitrarily. And while the process impoverishes many, does that ring a bell? It actually enriches some. The sight of this arbitrary rearrangement of riches strikes not only at security, but at confidence in the equity of the existing distribution of wealth. So this was John Maynard Keynes saying that inflation actually helps redistribute wealth from the general public to the very few. And there's proof there from the Federal Reserve Board. Another definition of inflation, or to inflate. This is from the Oxford Dictionary back in 1925. And it says, abnormally increase state's currency, especially by issue of inconvertible paper. There you go. That's inflation. CPI is not inflation. I think people need to really wake up and realize that we do have inflation, that the people who tell us we have a danger of deflation are actually working for the top 1% to keep the scheme going, the financialization scheme going. I'm trying to warn the bottom 90% here that if they have still some savings in paper, it is my opinion that that savings in fiat currency, in dollars, pounds, euros, or whatever national currency you hold, is going to lose a lot of value. It's going to shrink your wealth massively. It's going to redistribute it to the top 1% or even top 10% to some extent, but it's more towards the top 1%. So why did we have the billionaires of this world do really well since the crisis? Well, because they've inflated the system, and that's what I want to look at today. I want to look at money supply figures. So from the US to show you that there's massive inflation. We might not be feeling it right now in terms of rising prices. Of course, we have been feeling it for years. It's just that it's been a little more gradual, but I think it's going to accelerate a lot. It's interesting. I saw yesterday a little interview that Mike from Rethinking the Dollar did with someone in Detroit, I think, out in the street, an older gentleman. He asked him, what could you buy with $1, when you were 9 or 10 years old? And the guy was saying loads of things he could buy. He could buy like 6 to 7 items with $1. So those people who say there is no inflation, they're deluded. They need to do a little bit of research and homework about that. So let's look at the tsunami of inflation that we've had this year. Yes, we've had a tsunami of inflation. We've had M1 money supply, and all these figures are coming from the Federal Reserve, right? M1 money supply in the US since February 24th until September 14th increased by 40.4%. So it went from 3.97 trillion M1 money supply. And here's what M1 money supply is for those of you who don't know, right? You can pause the video and look at it to see what M1 is. So annualized, that is 72.48%. I mean, that is almost hyperinflation, like that inflation of the money supply. M2, which is M1 plus other aspects of the money supply. And again, you can pause the video and have a look. I've provided you the information here. So for the same time period, M2 has gone from $15.4 trillion to $18.7 trillion. That is an increase of 21.16%. Annualized, it's almost 38%. And finally, M3, and this is over 5 months. So just over 5 months. This is the data that I could get. That's how much data they've provided so far. The Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. So from February 2020 to July 2020, M3 money supply is grown by 44.75% annualized, from around $15.4 trillion to $18.3 trillion. And if you think there's not going to be rising prices in the next 12 months, you're very deluded. They might tinker with the calculations of CPI. They might eliminate with core numbers everything that goes up, like food and energy, and say, oh, actually underlying or headline inflation is very limited. They might use PCE, which is a statistic on prices that the Federal Reserve uses to justify that there is no inflation, right? And we've even had the Federal Reserve now come out and say that they want even more higher prices. They say they want more inflation, but they are inflating. That's what you need to understand. They need to justify the inflation that they're creating by saying that prices, which they call inflation, are really low, that they want to go above 2%. But it's all really a scam, I would say. It's going to suck even more wealth, as you've seen there, from the general public, from the bottom 90%, and especially the bottom 50, as you saw from that chart, even more. As you can see here, this is happening everywhere. This global synchronized debasement, as Crescat Capital calls it. It's been happening since 2001. We're seeing all the major currencies around the world lose value versus gold, and that's going to accelerate even more in the coming years. People holding paper money or national currencies, they're going to be left holding the bag, while the top 1% are going to become even richer because they hold very little of fiat currency in the bank. Yeah, relatively speaking, they might have a lot there for us, like $100,000 or $200,000, but compared to their wealth, it's like a drop in the ocean. So yeah, you need to, in my opinion, be very careful of holding too much paper currency. And what's the point of holding bonds as well? Bonds, treasuries, or corporate bonds, they're denominated in these national currencies. And even if the Federal Reserve inflates the prices of these bonds, it's not going to inflate it as quickly as the money supply. Your currency is going to lose value much quicker than the bonds are going to gain value. And you're going to be left holding the bag. So, and I think investors are also, big investors are soon going to realize that bonds are not going to protect them. So just to finish off, I'll give you an idea of who Felix Somary was. And the book, The Raven of Zurich, Felix Summary memoirs, is very hard to get, very expensive. I bought it many years ago, and it didn't cost me much, so I was fortunate to buy it years ago before it became popular. So it says here about him, from 1941 to 1943, he advised the American Department of Defense on finance issues. That was during World War II. That's how respected this guy was. He had been consulted regarding the methods that should be deployed in order to establish a sound currency in European and African war zones. This being prior to the Allied landings in North Africa and France, as an important prerequisite for achieving economic stability. When they told him that the Americans were thinking of abolishing the Japanese emperor, he was outraged, and then he asked, "With whom are you going to sign the peace treaty?" Don't be fooled by all this talk of deflation. You saw in the charts earlier how M1, M2, M3 money supply have been accelerating for decades. They've been going up like this for decades. That's inflation. And now they're actually accelerating. They're going up like a rocket. And we're told that there's no inflation. What they're telling us that there isn't is their phony measure of CPI, right? Which they call inflation. Rising prices, as we know, is a consequence of inflation. And yes, the very wealthy, the top 10%, top 1%, they don't feel it because they're protected and they have plenty of money and they don't really notice the increase in prices of essentials like the bottom 50 or even bottom 90% notice, right? And that's how they get away with it. Hopefully that will help you understand that the state alone is responsible for inflation and currency devaluation as Felix Summary said. So before I finish, I highly recommend you watch my video from about 4 years ago. Probably the presentation, the quality of the video is not as good as my videos are now. I was just starting out back then. I think I've just got over 1,000 views for that video, but I think it's really important that people listen to that. And don't get fooled again next year when they tell us that it was coronavirus that caused inflation, right? Because it's not coronavirus. It's the government and the central bank working together to increase the supply of money and credit in an exorbitant fashion, like we're seeing now. 70% plus M1, 40% M2, and just under 40% M3. I mean, wake up, people. Smell the inflation. There you go. So if you enjoyed this video, make sure you hit the like button. Please share it far and wide. Think about subscribing to my channel if you haven't yet. And you can also follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and all these other platforms below here. I wish you all a great weekend, and I'll talk to you later tonight for the live stream at 9 p.m. London. Bye.